Ever since Russia invaded Ukraine, the UK has stood as one of Ukraine's staunchest supporters. The country has delivered around £21.8 billion, or around $28 billion, to Ukraine already, and it's now offering support for Ukraine's growing drone manufacturing industry. This shows that the UK is doing everything in its power to make sure that Vladimir Putin feels the pain for the war that he started. And now the UK is about to hit Putin even harder. It just became Putin's biggest nightmare, as the UK has announced a wave of new sanctions that may just cut Russia's last economic lifeline. Those sanctions are varied and cover almost the entire gamut of the energy sector upon which Russia relies to fund its actions in Ukraine. As the Kyiv Independent reported on October 15, the UK is taking aim with what it calls its strongest sanctions yet against Russia. Over 90 entities and vessels have been targeted by the UK's new sanctions package, including 5 individuals and 35 of Russia's most important companies. 2 of those companies stand out: Rosneft and Lukoil. Both are drivers of the fossil-fueled revenue that's keeping Russia going as it burns billions of dollars thanks to Putin's invasion, meaning neither will be happy to learn that the UK is implementing sanctions against them. Rosneft is a particularly big target for any Western country that wants to hurt Russia using economic measures. The Kyiv Independent reports that the company accounts for nearly 50% of Russia's annual oil production, meaning it's such a massive producer that it accounts for 6% of all oil produced around the world. It's also a company that has benefited massively from Putin's Ukraine invasion, at least until recently. 2023 and 2024 were particularly good years for Rosneft. In February 2024, Reuters revealed that the company had announced a massive 47.2% increase in its new profit, earning $14.07 billion throughout the course of the year. That would have been great news for Putin. High profit is an indicator of high revenue, and Russia gets to tax the latter to keep billions flowing into Putin's war chest. In 2024, Rosneft would have also been a major contributor to the $131 billion in tax that the Kremlin generated from its oil and gas sector. Having said all of that, 2025 hasn't been quite as rosy for the company. In August, Reuters reported that Rosneft experienced a 68% year-on-year decline in net income during the first half of 2025. That amounted to $3 billion lost, with the company claiming that a combination of OPEC restrictions and lower oil prices was to blame. A surplus of 2.6 million barrels of oil per day exists on the market, though this will drop to 2.2 million in 2026, Reuters added. It seems that the company was able to make hay while the sun shone, and that it hoped it would be able to ride out the rest of 2025 until surplus stocks decreased and oil prices rose. The UK sanctions now make that a lot harder. Rosneft will no longer be able to sell to the UK and, as will be revealed later, will also not be able to generate revenue from the UK buying oil products made using Rosneft oil, even if those products come from countries other than Russia. As for Lukoil, it's been having a much rougher time than Rosneft in recent months. The same issues that Rosneft has experienced are also affecting this other Russian energy giant, and profit has been the main victim. In March, the Moscow Times reported that Lukoil's profits had dropped by 26.5% in 2024, as the company grappled with acid-related losses and Russia asking for even more tax on its oil sales. The company was still profitable for the year. It generated $10.1 billion in net profit off revenue of $102.1 billion. But that $10.1 billion represented a sharp decline from the $13.7 billion in profit Lukoil had enjoyed in 2023. The signs of a company slipping down a slope were starting to appear, and as with Rosneft, 2025 has been hitting Lukoil even harder. On September 29, Upstream Online reported that Lukoil's oil and gas production had fallen to its lowest in 4 years during the first half of 2025. Lukoil had been dealing with these declines for a while. Production had decreased in both 2023 and 2024, though it's now dealing with lower production than it's experienced at any point since the Ukraine war began. For a company that stands to profit heavily from the sheer amount of oil and gas Russia needs to sell so Putin can continue waging his war, these declines are painful. Lukoil has been staggering for a while now. The UK has just arrived to deliver a swift kick to the teeth with its new sanctions. But though Rosneft and Lukoil are the headline grabbers when it comes to the UK's new sanctions package, they're far from the only entities that the UK is targeting. Earlier, it was noted how Rosneft won't be able to generate revenue by selling crude oil to countries that then turn that crude into refined oil products, such as gasoline, to sell to the UK. The same applies to Lukoil, and the reason why neither country will be able to make money via this route is simply the UK has also banned the import of oil products that are refined in third countries that use Russian crude oil. That's according to the UK's official press release covering the new sanctions packages, and it essentially means that the UK is implementing secondary sanctions against the countries that try to sell its oil products that have a traceable Russian origin. To understand the impact of this particular sanction, it's necessary to examine one of the clever ways that Russia gets around countries banning direct oil product purchases from Russia. Take India as an example. The Ukraine war has been a massive boon for India when it comes to crude oil imports, with sanctions forcing Russia into a position where it had to sell crude oil far more cheaply than it otherwise would. India has been buying as much as it can get its hands on. One example of this was discussed in an Al Jazeera article from August. The piece profiles an Indian oil company named RIL, with a particular focus on that company's Jamnagar refinery. In 2021, that refinery's crude imports from Russia amounted to 3% of its total imports. After the war in Ukraine, that percentage has rocketed up to the point where 50% of the refinery's crude oil now comes from Russia. During the first 7 months of 2025, this one refinery has purchased 18.3 million tons of Russian crude oil, which in itself is a 64% over the same period from 2024. This example covers one refinery. However, this is a trend that's happening all across India, along with any other country that's still willing to buy Russia's crude oil. And this is where the UK's new sanctions come into play. Russia is still able to profit, albeit third hand, from countries that have placed sanctions against its oil because it's selling to refineries in other countries. Russia sells to India, then India refines the Russian oil, selling it on as an Indian product to other nations. Ultimately, Russia still gets to generate revenue from its oil because it's using countries that don't have sanctions against its oil to give it access to countries that do have sanctions. Russia knew exactly what it was doing here. In an October article, Reuters revealed that India, at one point, was enjoying discounts of up to $25 per barrel of oil that it bought from Russia. That discount is markedly lower now, as it hovers around the $2 mark. But even that means India pays less for Russian oil than it would for the equivalent product from other nations. India gets to make more money, and Russia can continue to sell. That's a problem. And it's one that the UK intends to solve, at least in its own territory, with its third country sanctions. Any nation that uses Russian crude to make refined oil products that it sells to the UK now faces a choice. It either drops the UK as a customer, which could cost millions, or it drops Russia as a supplier, meaning it has to pay higher prices for oil from elsewhere. Either way, that nation is getting punished for buying Russian oil, and ideally, the UK will be taking customers away from Russia in the process. And it gets worse for Russia. While much of the focus of the UK's latest batch of sanctions seems to be on Russia's oil, liquid natural gas, or LNG, hasn't escaped the UK's notice. The UK long ago banned imports of LNG from Russia, having implemented that particular ban in December 2022, with Russian LNG imports banned from January 1st, 2023. However, this is still an industry from which Russia is able to generate billions of dollars per year, thanks in large part to its shadow fleet of clandestine vessels that are illegally transporting Russian energy products around the world. That shadow fleet will be revisited later in the video, as the UK has hit that fleet hard with sanctions too. But sticking with LNG for the moment, this is an industry that the Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air says was earning Russia about $43 to $44 million per day in September alone. That amounts to $1.26 to $1.3 billion for a single month, highlighting yet another energy-based sector that's funding Putin's Ukraine war. Given that it can't make any more impact on Russia's LNG directly due to having a ban in place, the UK has instead followed a similar approach to the one it's taken for third-party oil refining. It's hitting other nations that benefit from Russia's LNG. The UK's press release covering the sanctions explains in more detail. The UK is today also sanctioning 7 specialised LNG tankers and the Chinese Beihai LNG terminal, the UK says. Beihai has been importing LNG from Arctic LNG 2, the severely disrupted flagship Russian LNG project, sanctioned by the UK in February 2024. More details on the sanctioned terminal come from G-Captain, which says that Beihai received its very first Arctic LNG 2 shipment on August 28 and has since become a key destination for Russia's LNG. Previously, the outlet states, Arctic LNG 2 was struggling because US sanctions imposed in 2023 had made it incredibly difficult for Russia to find any buyers. Even China was wary at first, as it believed that it would be exposing its energy companies to secondary sanctions from the US if it accepted Arctic LNG 2 cargo. That stance changed in August, following Putin's meeting with US President Donald Trump in Alaska. The UK has responded by implementing the types of sanctions that China feared. Granted, the UK using these secondary sanctions won't have as much of an impact as the US following through and doing the same. But it's still a little more pressure placed on a Russian LNG project that Putin really needs Arctic LNG 2 to go as well as it possibly can. The rest of the sanctions the UK has announced focused on the Shadow Fleet and a refinery in India. In the latter case, the UK has hit Nayara Energy with sanctions because it imported 100 million barrels of Russian crude oil in 2024. The UK says that this oil was worth $5 billion and that Nayara Energy profited from the sales of the refined products it developed using Russia's oil. This is precisely why India serves as the example here of how Russia has been using third-party refiners to continue generating revenue. And finally, the UK has levied sanctions against 44 tankers that have been identified as part of Russia's Shadow Fleet. That's an interesting set of sanctions. On the surface, it would seem that sanctions against Shadow Fleet vessels won't do much of anything. After all, Putin has spent an estimated $14 billion on Shadow Fleet vessels since the Ukraine war started, specifically because Russia needs to use those vessels to skirt Western sanctions on its oil sales. This fleet is made up of old tankers, and it uses a host of tricks to evade the authorities. These include sailing under the flags of nations other than Russia, having complicated ownership structures that make each ship's true owners difficult to track, and the disabling of automatic identification system transponders so they can't be monitored easily as they sail. Given that so much money and work have gone into building this fleet so that Russia can evade sanctions, it's difficult to see how the UK imposing sanctions on 44 of the vessels that are part of the Shadow Fleet could make much of a difference. But it does, and for several reasons. First, a sanction against a Shadow Fleet vessel essentially serves as a target. It's a country saying to Russia that it knows who this vessel belongs to and what it's doing. In other words, the ship can't hide anymore, and it will face issues if the nations that have sanctioned it sees it sailing. Russia will now have to avoid taking any sailing routes that puts its sanctioned vessels close enough to the UK for its ships to be identified. There are other issues that these sanctions cause. For example, the European Union or EU and the UK have implemented price caps on Russian oil. For both, that cap now stands at $47.60 per barrel, and it means that any Russian ship carrying oil that Russia wants to sell for more than that cap can be punished. That's where Shadow Fleet sanctions come into play. Russia is trying to sell for more than the price cap, though it's still less than the going rate for a barrel of oil via its Shadow Fleet. With its sanctions, the UK is telling all of its companies that they cannot provide insurance, flagging or finance services to these specific vessels. No insurance means a Shadow Fleet ship has an even harder time getting away with its activities. And that's the point. Shadow Fleet sanctions don't disable the targeted ships completely. However, they make it much harder for Russia to operate those ships without putting itself at risk of losing both the vessel and the cargo it's carrying. In some cases, Shadow Fleet sanctions even lead to Russia permanently docking ships that it's purchased because it's too much trouble to sail them. By that point, Russia has wasted money buying the ship, and it's one less avenue for transporting the energy products that it's selling to other nations. All told, the UK just unleashed a comprehensive sanctions package on Russia, and it's going to cause a lot of damage. The UK Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, makes that clear in a statement where she says, "As Putin's aggression intensifies, we're stepping up our response. The UK will continue to strip away the funding that fuels his war machine. We will hold to account all those enabling his illegal invasion of Ukraine." That last point explains why the UK now seems to be going after India and China as well as Russia. Reeves's governmental colleague, UK Foreign Secretary Yvette Cooper, also commented on the new sanctions. At this critical moment for Ukraine, Europe is stepping up. Together, the UK and our allies are piling the pressure on Putin, going after his oil, gas and shadow fleet. And we will not relent until he abandons his failed war of conquest and gets serious about peace, Cooper stated. She added that Putin continues to force Russia's military to endure unthinkable losses, all as he attacks Ukraine. Russia's war economy is creaking, Cooper adds. The UK intends to do its part in turning that creaking into a full-blown collapse. The UK also decided to add a little bit of insult to injury with its latest round of sanctions. Their timing is very deliberate, as the package's unveiling just so happens to coincide with Russian Energy Week. The Russian news agency TASS reports that Putin will be attending and speaking at that event's plenary session. Apparently, the theme of this year's iteration of the event, which has been running since 2016, is building the energy of the future together, TASS reports. Russia's going to have an even harder time doing that now that the UK has levied so many new sanctions against it. Putin is reeling from this UK blow, but he also knows that he has another one coming. It's important to remember that the UK is no longer a part of the EU, so every sanction package it delivers comes directly from the UK rather than a wider European bloc. As much as these sanctions will hurt Russia, Putin knows that the stiff shot his country just took is going to be followed by an even heavier hit. The EU is planning its 19th sanctions package at this very moment, and it will likely follow hot on the heels of what the UK just implemented. Politico reports that the EU's upcoming package will likely go even further than the UK's, as it's going to target entities in countries like Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and the United Arab Emirates. A draft of the EU package also reveals the names of 120 Shadow Fleet tankers that are going to be hit with sanctions, along with 9 banks, a pair of oil trading houses, and an international cryptocurrency exchange that appears to be allowing Russia to receive energy product revenue using crypto. Politico also notes that the draft version of the EU sanctions package document it saw contained a space for entry of third country ports that are receiving Russian products. That space was blank on September 24. The UK may have just given the EU a few clues about what it should be targeting with its list of sanctions. Ultimately, everything that the UK announced on October 15 is designed to heap more pressure on a Russian energy sector that is ailing right now. And without that sector, the entire Russian economy would collapse. After all, Russia is afflicted with an energy-centric version of the Dutch disease that's causing the country to rot from the inside. Find out more in our video, and remember to subscribe to the Military Show for more videos highlighting the latest sanctions being used to punish Russia for the Ukraine invasion.